it's extremely invigorating and heartening to see, oh yes, we've completed a century now. There are 100 participants who are attending this. And at a time when we're really inundated, saturated is the word, with a discourse on India-China relations that is marked by extreme belligerence and provocation, with all possible variants of strategic and tactical confrontation, denunciation stemming from emotive nationalism, and diatribes drenched in distrust. It's a nice alliteration, right? So this book is more than a breath of fresh air. And pardon my use of this analogy in these COVID days, it is vitally needed oxygen for our scholarly lungs. And I would even go further to say that it's a critical therapeutic intervention in this time of crisis. I must begin with a confession. Having received the book only a couple of days back, I have only read the crisp but comprehensive introduction, the crisper but highly thought-provoking epilogue, and the chapter by Madhavi, to whom, in fact, I owe my initiation into the significance of this fascinating historical period. And I must here recall her efforts in starting the archival project at the ICS and helping the Institute to conduct a series of workshops in this regard during my directorship. In fact, the catalogue of materials related to modern China in the National Archives of India, that was the title, yes. It was published as an occasional paper by the ICS in 2013. And I can say for a fact that it has contributed to triggering an interest in the history of India-China relations among young researchers. Now, according to the program, I have 10 minutes. I assure you I will not go beyond 5 more minutes. So just let me say a few things. See, many of the themes that are woven in this volume have in fact been the subject of considerable discussion and research by the faculty of the ICS. The civilizational dimension, for instance, or the Himalaya sphere, fathered by Professor Thanchung, which is viewed as quote-unquote idealistic and controversial. The use of critical theories in comparative analysis, the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist underpinnings of scholarship in India-China interactions, alternative modernities, and so on. So this has been part of a very important part of the intellectual focus of the Institute of Chinese Studies, and therefore it is truly wonderful that we see this quote-unquote zone of convergence, to borrow Prasenjit's marvelous coinage, which I believe perfectly describes this assembly of China centers from the School of International Studies and the School of Language, Literature, Culture Studies in the JNU, the Indian Council of World Affairs, and the publishers of this notable volume on the ICS platform. Now, as I said, I do not intend to stand between you and the feast that has been laid out. I will just take a couple of minutes to air some thoughts that I have been tossing about in my head for some time now, discussed occasionally with colleagues, but which are still in need of greater refinement and elucidation. And I'm hopeful that after this discussion is over, I will have gathered enough pointers to take me further ahead in my own ruminations and reflections. Now, the first is this business of Asia. We are taking up for study a landmass described as a continent and named Asia. So what is this Asia? What trusses us? What connects us as Asians? It was my guru, Professor Deshpande, GPD as I used to call him, who first instructed me about the fact that most of the Indian languages, the classical tongues, Sanskrit and Pali, for instance, or even the more modern ones dating back to about 1,000 years or so, do not have a name for Asia. There is at best a transliteration. In fact, he said that there was no awareness of Asia in the pre-colonial times. Neither does there seem to be a Chinese word. Yachou is a transliteration. The dictionary tells us that Yachou is a word for Asia. So as GPD used to say, that even classical Chinese tradition has no awareness of Asia. It was Europe which created this awareness. And it was that the colonial encounter that brings Asia into our framework. The second aspect is with respect to the understanding of Asia. The idealist or realist perceptions of Asianness or Asian unity would stem from how we understand Asia. In that context, Takeuchi Yoshimi's Asia as method or Okakura Tenshin's Pan-Asianism are indeed, as has been said in the introduction, replete with ambiguity. But this does trigger further thinking on this construction of Asia. And it actually resonates also with what the editors refer to as the arbitrariness of categories in the introduction. Because much of what we understand as Asia is an invention of colonial scholarship, what Said said, explained as Orientalism. Because not all Asian entities and civilizations were treated equally in colonial scholarship. Pan-Asianism, as Prasenjit has pointed out in the epilogue, was a hijacking by Japanese militarists to serve an ideology of imperialist domination, a kind of imperialism of anti-imperialism. Another delightful phrase. So that's probably one of the factors, one of the many factors which could explain why no Pan-Asian movement ever succeeded. Now, Prasenjit has also pointed out that there has been little analysis of, quote unquote, on the ground relations between India, modern India and China. So the question that flows out of the 2 points that I have just mentioned is it because this landmass we call Asia and the billions of Asians who inhabit this landmass do not really have a common or shared view of Asia, which could be a critical binder in their relationship? To the extent that we saw this surge in Asian consciousness during the anti-colonial times has been completely dissipated with the emergence of the developmental nation state and the globalized economy. So the thing that keeps on, that I keep on grappling with is that Europe defined Asia for the Asians. Maybe this volume will help us embark on a process of reverse engineering, as it were. Maybe it's time to settle scores with Hegel, in a manner of speaking. I'm happy now to introduce Ambassador TCA Raghavan. Actually, that's an oxymoron. Since no introduction is really required, it would be more apt to say that I now call upon Ambassador Raghavan, a former Indian whose understanding and knowledge on Pakistan has probably no parallel in the Foreign Service today. After a vast and varied career in many parts of the world, Mr. Raghavan's last stint was High Commissioner of India to Pakistan. However, it is after retirement that things got more interesting. His background in the discipline of history came to the fore, and he authored 2 books. The first, biography of 2 Mughal nobles, and the other, a study of India-Pakistan relations. Since July 2018, he has been the Director General of the Indian Council of World Affairs and has organized an extremely interesting range of events, bringing together noted and notable scholars, practitioners, diplomats, and state leaders to interact on issues of contemporary significance. We are extremely happy that he has accepted our invitation to don his historian's hat this evening and deliver the keynote address. Ambassador Raghavan, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Acharya, for that very generous introduction. Thank you, Ambassador Ashok Kant, and thank you, Tansen Sen, for inviting me and inviting the ICWA to join in the launch of this wonderful volume. On behalf of the ICWA, I can say that I'm delighted that we can do this together with the Institute of Chinese Studies, some months earlier, before the pandemic, we had a commemorative event at Sapru House on the 50 years of the Institute of Chinese Studies. And it was appropriate because the Institute of Chinese Studies really was born on the lawns of Sapru House, as Professor Mohanty had then reminded us. So I'm very happy that we can do this event together, and I'm sure there'll be many other opportunities for the ICS and the ICWA to do things together. May I congratulate you, Professor Tansen Sen, and also your co-editor, Professor Brian Su, as also all the contributors to this wonderful volume, which juxtaposes a number of themes, India and China, of course, but also in the wider canvas of Asia or Pan-Asianism. The title, of course, suggests that you want to look at India-China relations in their own right and step back from Pan-Asianism, because that has been the traditional context in which many ideas of India-China relations have been constructed. But the book itself throws up really many different points of view and also opens up various lines of inquiry. So I do wish to congratulate you on this very seminal work, because the present context was pointed to by Professor Alka Acharya, but both India and China are going to have relations which are of great importance, not just for themselves, but also for the whole region and indeed for the world. So a deep history of that relationship from different points of view, and especially looking at the 19th and early 20th centuries in greater detail, is something to be greatly welcomed. And I congratulate you again on the set of ideas which would have led to this volume and the different contributions to it. Now, I'm not an expert on the subject, so I don't wish to comment on any of the papers or the introduction or the very fine epilogue by Professor Prasenjit Dwara, but some stray thoughts did come to me, and I thought of sharing them with, of course, the initial disclaimer that I'm by no means a scholar of the subject, and my own understanding of it is really derived from the writing of scholars such as those present here. The first point which came to me was about the complexities of Asianism, some of which were pointed to by Professor Alka Acharya, but really the idea of Asia in Asia received a very great fill-up in the first decade of the 20th century, following the Japanese victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War. I think in India, certainly, because that moment coincided with a nationalist upsurge following the partition of Bengal and the rise of the Swadeshi movement, but it certainly made many public figures in India start looking at the map of the world and trying to identify the Asian continent within it with much greater interest than they had done in the past. But as one of the chapters in this book brings out, even at that time there was a great deal of ambiguity surrounding this view of Asia, because in India certainly the Japanese victory was seen as a great triumph for the whole concept of a non-European power establishing a powerful hegemonic position on the world stage. In China, the view was, of course, much more nuanced and perhaps much more cynical because of their own experience of the interface with Japan in the late 19th century. But nevertheless, the principal takeaway which remained was the emergence of a kind of triangle between Japan, India, and China. And in many ways, that has remained with us, certainly through the first half of the 20th century, and perhaps in many ways up to our own times. It is also true that while the ideas of Asia emerged very strongly in India only from the first decade of the 20th century. But there were intellectuals who were thinking about the rest of Asia as they sought to understand European domination of the world even earlier. One example which comes to mind is of Keshav Chandra Sen, a leading intellectual of the Brahmo Samaj in Calcutta. And he, in the 1880s, spoke a great deal about the idea of Asia in opposition and in juxtaposition to the idea of Europe. And that stream of thinking, in fact, has a long continuity through Tagore, through Chittaranjan Das, to Jawaharlal Nehru, and really ends in some ways with the holding of the Asian Relations Conference, which the ICWA hosted in New Delhi in 1947, a few months before our independence. And again, it is interesting to find at the Asian Relations Conference, this Japan, India, China triangle again assumed some importance, because we are working on an internal history of the ICWA. And in many of the documents which we have encountered, we find this question very, very important at that time of who to invite from Japan, because Japan was then under American occupation, and the question of who finally would attend from Japan remained unanswered till the inaugural of the conference. So this is one thought which came to me. The other point which emerged, and I read Professor Dwara's epilogue about nationalism and Asianism when he has some ideas about that. And really, I recalled something which my former teacher, Professor Sabyasachi Bhattacharya, had said to me, and I thought it is relevant because so much of in the India-China interface, both in a purely bilateral context, but also in a against the wider canvas of Asia, is informed by nationalism. And Professor Bhattacharya had pointed to what he called a historical paradox between nationalism and the ideas of Asianism. And I cannot but resist reading out a small quote from one of his writings. And I quote, "I would like to point to a historical paradox. To my mind, it is a historical paradox. The transnational idea of Asianism arises from the discourse of nationalism in modern times. It was the nationalist ideologues who posited in the late 19th century and in the 20th centuries the transnational notion of Asia as a larger civilizational category, distinct from the political entity, the nation state, which nationalists made it their business to create or shape. The paradox lies in the apparent contradiction between the intellectual stances in respect of the inclusive discourse on civilization on the one hand, and on the other, the exclusionary principle inherent in the discourse of nationality and citizenship." So really taking up what Prasenjit Dwara says in his epilogue, and I'm sure you'll talk about it also, this idea of nationalism as a principal factor in whichever way we look at in the India-China interface, whether in the 19th century or post 1947, remains as a very, very predominant idea. And we cannot really erase it, even when we try to locate it within the larger canvas of Pan-Asianism and Asianism. The third point which came to my mind was about the discourses on India and China from intellectuals in both these countries, respectively. And in the chapters, there were many such illustrations about historians, writers, and many others who dwelt a great deal on this subject, led, of course, by Rabindranath Tagore, but also Jawaharlal Nehru and many, many others. This tradition was, of course, till 1962, very strong in India. And K.M. Panikkar, someone else who was associated with the ICWA in the 1950s, had written, again I quote, "Undoubtedly what gave a spiritual and central unity to non-Islamic Asia was the prolonged contact between India and China." Now, what interested me was that while we know about the political opposition to this idea and a counter view, which was articulated in many ways by Sardar Patel's very famous letter to Jawaharlal Nehru in the late 1950s, in the early 1950s, about India's China policy. But I wonder about other critiques, and certainly there were a number of historical and intellectual critiques of this particular view of India-China relations. And two people who come to mind, and I would very much like to know more about them, were, one of them is Dr. Raghuvira, who founded the Institute of Asian Culture, made many visits to China, and in many ways was a scholar of Chinese and Indian civilizational contacts. But he was a very strong critic of this view from the early 1950s. And the second person who comes to mind is the great Indian Tibetologist Nirmal Chandra Sinha. And recently I encountered a lecture which he gave in the University of Bhagalpur about how this idea of India-China interface that is smooth is fundamentally flawed. So I do think, given the context of our own times and in the interests of a fair and objective deep history of India-China intellectual contacts, these counter critiques also require to be reflected on and used in our construction of architecture of India-China relations. My final point is not directly related, but it's something which has interested me for many years. And it is about a tangential view of China, which a number of historians who are otherwise not great, very close scholars of Chinese history, but this tangential view of China, which they developed from the 1920s and 1930s because of their interest in Southeast Asia. Now, this group of historians had grouped themselves under the umbrella of the Greater India Society and the Greater India Movement. And they were principally studying Southeast Asia, mainland Southeast Asia, and to some extent Indonesia. And what fascinated them were the remnants of Indian culture, Indian ideas from the first millennium, the remnants which they encountered in the writing of Dutch and French archaeologists from the early 20th century. And the question they asked was that why should a region which is so proximate to China, and they were talking about Indochina, Cambodia, Vietnam, and so on, why should a region which is so proximate to China have been so open to Indian ideas, Indian culture, Indian artifacts, and so on? Unfortunately, following from an older tradition of European scholarship, these Indian historians had termed this expansion of Indian ideas, or this reception of Indian ideas as being Indian colonies in the Far East. And because they were termed as colonies, with decolonization, this kind of scholarship was vitiated by what the term which Prasenjit Dwara has also used, which is the imperialism of the anti-imperialists, or something like it. So this kind of scholarship didn't survive beyond the 50s, but this tangential view of China in its proximate regions, viewed by historians from India, is something which has always struck me as being of great interest. And really, the papers in this volume evoked that interest again. So may I, in conclusion, again thank Ambassador Ashok Kant and the Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting the ICWA and for inviting me to join this platform. I'm very happy to be able to congratulate Professor Tan Sen Sen and Professor Brian Su for this wonderful volume, and I greatly look forward to the discussion that will follow. Thank you very much.
Thanks indeed, Ambassador Raghavan. I think your very thought-provoking keynote has actually confirmed my assessment of the volume as likely to lead to 1,100 flowers blooming. Out of this research comes so many different notions, different avenues for further research. And clearly, we're just about beginning to start addressing the myriad issues, and what you have spoken about is actually confirming that view that much more is needed, and this volume is clearly initiating that process that will hopefully bring many more scholars into this fold. I will now hand over the floor to the editors of the volume. Professor Tan Sen Sen, who is a professor of history and director of the Center for Global Asia at NYU, Shanghai, in China, and global network professor at the NYU in Shanghai. He's currently working on a book about Cheng He's maritime expeditions in early 15th century and co-editing with Ang Sung Ho, the Cambridge History of the Indian Ocean. That sounds really formidable. And Brian Sui, who teaches at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University of China. He is interested in the, now let me quote, intersection between revolutionary politics and mobilization of cultures on both the left and the right in China's 20th century. His current research focuses on the advent of New China as an Asia-wide event, zeroing in on how the early People's Republic of China was interpreted by Indian nationalists and Asian Christians in the 1950s. Really, really remarkable. That sounds fascinating. And it also, in one sense, underscores the complete suitability of these two editors to bring out a volume such as this one. So over to you, Tan Sen.
I think Brian is going to go first. He has a PowerPoint that we'll share. So Brian, you want to share the PowerPoint?
So I will just dive in. So thank you, Professor Acharya, for organizing this event. It's very nice to see a lot of colleagues online, and for her very generous introduction. I also want to thank Ambassador Van Goen for his very insightful, provoking keynote address. What I'm going to do in my short presentation is to introduce to let us know how this volume came about, and then go through some themes that Professor Acharya and Ambassador have already touched on. So this project, this volume came out of a grant, a research grant that Tan Sen and I secured from the Jiang Jingguo Cheng Qingguo Foundation for International Scholarly Exchange, which of course is based in Taipei. The goals back then was to produce this volume, and also to bring about an electronic catalog in both English and Chinese on major archival depositories that pertain to China-India studies in the modern period. Our project started with a core group, so that was a Tan Sen, and then Matathi, Camel Shield, Anan Yang, Liao Wenshuo, and Zhang Ke. I think all of them with us tonight. We first met in Canberra at the Australian National University, where I was then based as a postdoctoral fellow. We met for a few more times in Hong Kong, in Shanghai, and also in Taipei. So I thank the institutions which have hosted us and sort of allow this project to grow. So the idea of these meetings was to sort of map out the themes that the volume will cover, and also to identify sort of contributors to this volume. So we ended up with 14 chapters, core chapters written by 14 different scholars in both literary and historical studies. The themes that with introduction, of course, but also that sort of tied together the chapters. I think there are 5. I think later on, Tencent might fill us in if I have missed anything. So we are very concerned with the use of sources, archives, and libraries. So one of the ways in which these the grant was used was to help us in the core team to look for this archival materials in respective in the archives that they're most familiar with. So, for example, in the case of Tencent, he spent a lot of time with the West Bengal State Archives. We have Zhang Ke, who had a student assistant to go through the archival materials in Shanghai and Chongqing, and so on. So materials, and we also have sort of literary scholars who work with non-archival and literary sources, so that we can see that in some of the chapters in the volume. And then, of course, in terms of themes, we have Pan-Asianism in our title, and the previous 2 speakers have already alluded to this, the ambiguities and the complicated legacies of this idea organizing method, and that have been this sort of this idea of Pan-Asianism has been discussed in a few of our chapters. We are interested not only in sort of nation-state to nation-state relations, but also in sort of trends and connections that go beyond not only the present states of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of India, but also through the South Asia, East Asia, and beyond. And we, of course, are interested in connections and events, trends beyond national politics, state politics, and state borders. And finally, we wanted to sort of reconceptualize how we sort of understand how the topic of the whole idea of China-India study. What does it bring to us on the table in our sort of pandemic sort of era, as sort of the social models brought about, represented by sort of Washington and London, seems to be in trouble. Whether sort of using China and India as method, which of course is a gesture towards using the historical experiences of these 2 societies to interrogate cultural categories and also the dominance of nation-state-led developmentalism. So that his themes tie this volume together, and I hope the introduction does a decent job walking the readers through these themes. So I will now hand over to Tan Sen, and I will be interested in your comments and questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think if you can go to the next slide, Brian, and I would like to thank Ambassador Kant and High Commissioner Raghavan. Both of them I knew as diplomats, Ambassador Kant when he was in Beijing, and then High Commissioner Raghavan when he was in Singapore. In fact, it's good that you brought up the Greater India Society. And if you remember, in Singapore, we actually worked on compiling some of the writings of these Indian historians that you were mentioning into a book. And I think that's a very, very important, valuable book that we published from Singapore with your help. And as you remember, P.C. Bakshi was one of the figures involved in the Greater India Society. Kalidas Nag was another. Both of them actually trained in sinology, some of the leading figures in India doing China studies. But thank you to ICS, ICWA for co-hosting this event. Whatever Brian was saying as far as themes are concerned are in the introduction. What I'll be doing here, talking about the different sections. Many of you don't have this book. So I'll just point out some of the sections and invite one person from that section to explain that section to us, what it accomplishes, and they will speak on behalf of the other contributors in this book. I'll then end up with what we are going next, where we are going with this collaborative research that we have done, and I would say successfully finished. But one thing I wanted to add with regard to the introduction is, if you see the subtitle, it's from 1840s to 1960s. We use that in order to question how India-China contacts, India-China relations are periodized. We didn't want to give a fixed date. Neither do we want to use 1962 as a huge watershed as well. So the reason we use 1840s and 1960s is something that is explained in the introduction as well. The introduction, as Brian was pointing out, has some critical issues that we hope others doing China and India could engage with us with regard to that. And I would highly encourage, if you don't have time to go through all the chapters, at least read the introduction and perhaps engage with us at some points in the future. It would be good to get feedback not only from those who are present here, but others who are going to read this book. So I would just go through these sections. If you see on the slide, the first section is a kind of intervention. These are three contributions that go beyond the archival research. These are looking at more of literature. And Adhira Mangalagiri, who is volunteering to talk about this section on behalf of the two other contributors. So I would ask her to briefly talk about the section and how it perhaps fits into the book and what kind of intervention you are making. Adhira?
Thanks, Nansen. Can everyone hear me all right?
Sure.
Hi, I'm Adhira Mangalagiri. I'm a lecturer in the Department of Comparative Literature at Queen Mary University of London, and I'm also an associate at the Harvard University Asia Center. I know, first of all, that all of the contributors join me in thanking you and Brian Nansen for bringing us all together and for all of your incredibly hard work to finally bringing this project to completion. So as Nansen mentioned, I'll talk about the first section entitled Epistemological Interventions. I remember when we met in Hong Kong, we had a very lengthy conversation about how exactly to go about organizing our volume. And we all agreed at the time that rather than a chronological progression of the chapters through the first decades of the 20th century, And also, rather than a strictly disciplinary division of our chapters, it would actually make much more sense for us to showcase the interdisciplinariness of our group and also to highlight the kinds of interventions that this volume makes in existing scholarship. So our section contains chapters from three of us who actually, although we're all working with texts in a way, approach the idea of China-India thought from very distinct disciplinary vantage points. The first chapter is by me, and my work is rooted in comparative literature. I work specifically on 20th century Chinese and Hindi Urdu texts in comparative frameworks, and I also work on writers who actively engage with ideas of China and India in their literary practice. The second chapter is by Goodwill, who is an assistant professor in the East Asian department at McGill University. Gal works primarily on modern Chinese literature during the late Qing and Republican periods, with a particular focus on religious thought and literary realism. And the third chapter is by Viren Murthy, an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, who works on the history of philosophy and the revival of pre-modern philosophies in the writings of 20th century East Asian intellectuals. Together, our three chapters in this section address how the China-India pairing actually disrupts dominant narratives of the development of intellectual thought in early 20th century China. When we look at existing scholarship on Republican China, we often find that engagements with the West or with Japan tend to be the main ways in which we understand the development of modern intellectual literary thought during this period. In contrast to such narratives, we wanted to ask, how did thinking about China and India together enable writers to critique colonial and imperial paradigms? And how did imaginations of India play a central, not simply peripheral, and also a transformative role in shaping Chinese intellectual and literary thought during the Republican period? So these are some of the questions that our section addresses. I'll go through now quickly each of the chapters. Chapter 1, as you can see, is entitled Slave of the Colonizer, the Indian Policeman in Chinese Literature. In this chapter, I address the literary figure of the Indian policeman, who, as many of you know, was stationed in Chinese treaty ports during the colonial period as an administrator and enforcer of colonial law on Chinese citizens. So my chapter reads a large collection of Chinese short stories, novels, and poetry that explicitly portray this figure of the Indian policeman. And I show how, through a literary engagement with this Indian figure, writers were actually able to participate in and to reshape ongoing debates that were going on in May 4th and Republican era literary spheres in China, especially in regards to the concept of language, national autonomy, and visions of revolution. The second chapter by Gal is entitled China-India Myths in Xu Dishan's Goddess of Supreme Essence. The chapter closely reads a 1923 short story by Xu Dishan, which showcases the writer's very long-standing scholarly interests in Sanskrit, Buddhism, Taoism, and comparative religion. Gal argues in the chapter that Xu Dishan's engagement with Indian mythology and religions deeply informed his fiction by constituting a critique of social Darwinist ideas that were immensely popular during the May 4th and Republican periods. And chapter 3 by Viren is entitled Rethinking Pan-Asianism through Zhang Taiyan, India as Method. Focusing on the writings of the Chinese revolutionary Zhang Taiyan, Viren shows how Zhang engages with an idea of India in order to critique imperialist epistemologies, including Hegelian visions of progressive history. In this way, Zhang Taiyan's writings bring into view a hypothetical China-India alliance that is capable of transcending this dominant idea we have of Pan-Asianism as a Japanese-led project. So together, the three chapters challenge the more familiar Republican era understandings of history, colonialism, and the role of literature in national transformation. The section contributes to the volume's themes of a very superficial, yet very dominant still, notion of China-India connections as a form of friendship. Instead, we try to show how ideas of India actually played a transformative and a very productively disruptive role in the development of modern Chinese intellectual thought. And then very briefly, I'll just say how our chapters contribute to this emerging field of China-India studies. The speakers have already highlighted how much potential there is for further research. And our chapters really show how there's a wealth of texts that are yet to be examined. My chapter, for example, unearths an archive of overlooked and forgotten fiction and poetry from Shanghai's journals and magazines, and there are likely many more that I'm yet to discover. But even beyond overlooked texts, even in the case of those historical figures who we think we know well, celebrated writers and intellectuals like Xu Dishan or Zhang Taiyan, there's still parts of their oeuvre that we are yet to explore, and there are still new ways to read their much discussed writings. Also, our section focuses on the Republican era in the Chinese context, but we hope that our work will point scholars and researchers toward exploring similar engagements with ideas of China in Indian literary and intellectual circles. In fact, many of us are already engaged in this kind of work, and I would invite any of you who are interested in this kind of work to join us. Okay, I'll end there, but I'm very happy to take questions about our section in the Q&A.
Thank you, Adira. So as Adira was pointing out, our purpose is not only to say something that is the final word on these things, is to encourage people attending this event to engage with us, just like in the introduction, you can engage with us with regard to the theoretical aspect of doing China and India. You will see in many of these sections, the authors are bringing in new ways of looking at existing sources, but also pointing out to new sources that need to be examined. So I hope students who are from JNU or DU would be encouraged to look through the footnotes and find things that are of interest and then work on those topics. You'll see a wealth of topics emerging, particularly from these three chapters and the sources that the three authors are using. So the next section, Brian, if you could move the slide next, the next slide. The section 2 is encounters and images. This is also has three chapters here. This, I think many of you in India are familiar with Kamal Sheel, who is, I think, in the audience here. But Chanka is going to talk about the three chapters that also talk about interesting sources from archives and from libraries. So Chanka, do you want to talk about your section?
Yes.
And introduce yourself, Chanka.
Sure. Thank you, Tansen. Can I be heard? Is it okay?
Yes, yes, you can be heard.
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Tansen. Hi, all. So it's my pleasure to participate in this book project, as I'm now an associate professor at Fudan University, Shanghai, China, and I'm very happy to join this meeting. And I will say that actually my first book was working on modern Chinese intellectual history and conceptual history. So like back to 5 years ago, I was a newcomer of Indian China studies. And I would say I learned a lot from all these meetings and conferences in our project. So and also from all the personal talks with all the colleagues and friends in this group. So I have to extend my thanks to Tansen, to Brian, and also to the organizers of this event, to ICS. So according to the format, I think I will briefly introduce our section, that is section 2. As Tansen have already mentioned, that the title of this section is Encounters and Images. So the word encounters actually implies that the section all the papers are mainly focused on the earlier period. And I would say it's from the mid 19th century to early 20th century. So the section consists of 3 chapters. The first chapter, my chapter actually is, the title is Through the Indian Lens, Observations and Self-Reflections in Late Qing Chinese Travel Writings on India. And the second, chapter 5 is written by Professor Kama Shiu, probably also here. And I think many of you are quite familiar with Professor Shiu. He is a distinguished professor from Banaras Hindu University. And his chapter is working on Indian-China connectedness explorations in Hindi sources materials on modern China. And chapter 6 is written by Professor Anna Yang. Professor Yang is also a renowned professor of history and international studies at University of Washington, Seattle. And his chapter is titled China in the Popular Imagination, Images of Qing in North India at the turn of 20th century. So I will say that the 3 chapters is both working on the mutual understandings and the mutual images of China, India, respectively, from each other in this time period. So I will briefly introduce the 3 chapters now. So first of all, my chapter, it has something to do with my another work, which I'm currently working on, is the editing and the compilation of all these Chinese travelogues to India at that time. Especially now I'm working on the late Qing period, that is from mid-19th century to 1911. So all these travelogues, and I, in my chapter, I investigated 10 travelogues, and all these authors, including many renowned and influential scholars and politicians like Kang Youwei and Ma Jianzhong and other authors. And I will argue that all these late Qing, all these late Qing Chinese writings on India actually reveal new types of connections, concerns, and perceptions compared to the content of past Chinese writings. As you know, like especially these writings by Buddhist monks. And this chapter actually examines some of the late Qing writing in order to demonstrate 2 modes of observation. 2 modes of observation and critical reflection. So on the one hand, by observing and analyzing India, the Chinese authors try to gain knowledge of British rule and the Western culture it represented. But on the other hand, seeing a reflection of China in India, they pondered China's own international crisis through these writings. So often these 2 modes were intertwined, with China and Britain alternatively become the other in the Chinese imagination. And chapter 5, written by Professor Kama Shiu, and also investigates all these Hindi sources from 19th century to First World War. And Professor Shiu mentioned that there are 4 types of subjects, 4 types of this kind of materials. I think the first type related to the introduction of China at that time through travelogues, pieces of information on Chinese life and society, stories and illustrations. And the second is all these essays, editorials, reviews, and the detailed comments on contemporary events in China. And the third actually is all these Indian intellectuals discussions of convergence and the differences between India and China in the context of searching an idea of Asia or Asianism at that time. And I think the fourth type actually is consists most of these news items taken from English papers on domestic politics, as well as internal international politics movements and so on. So Professor Shiu actually investigates important authors like Gadaha Singh, like Banasarga, like Tagore, of course. And I think they all basically, I would say that they praise the achievements of Chinese civilization and express the feeling of sympathy of China's contemporary crisis. And also, they paid a lot of attention to the 1911 revolution in China. And also, he investigates all these reactions to that revolution. And I think Professor Shiu's paper and Professor Anna Young's paper is closely connected, as Professor Anna Young also investigates how did people in colonial India consider China, and especially it's about the Boxer uprising and the foreign legation and the war in 1900. And I think Professor Young's article used a lot of materials. Not only that, I have to mention that Professor Shiu and Professor Young complete a very, I would say, fantastic translation and edition of Gadaha Singh's famous book and published it 3 years ago. So not only this book, but also other sources in Hindi, Urdu, and other languages. So he investigates how they perceive the clash between China and the foreign powers and the British in India at that time. So to summarize this, I would say that both of our papers just want to review the birth of and the development of the feeling of empathy and sympathy at that time from the mid-19th century to early 20th century, and also reviews the mutual understandings and images of China, India from both sides. So yeah, I think that I will introduce. Yeah.
Thank you, Chanka.
Thank you.
And this section also brings out new material that still needs to be explored. Even the book that Chanka just mentioned, translated by Anand and Kamal, 13 months in China. This is published in the series where this book is coming out. Is actually a resource that people can use to do further studies about the Boxers seen by Indians. There's actually another work on the Boxers written in Bengali that has not been translated into English that could also be seen how the Indian soldiers are going and fighting on behalf of the British in China. Very, very important sources and other sources that Chanka has written about, including Kang Yo Wei. Not a good, easy text to read, but very important text to understand how the Chinese are perceiving India in the turn of the century. The next section has 4 chapters. It's called Cultures and Mediators. It's looking at people and institutions that connected China and India. And to tell us about the section is Cao Yin. Cao Yin, introduce yourself and then the chapters.
Great, thanks, Tencent. And thank you for the organizers first. Thank you, Professor Acharya, and thank you, Ambassador Raghavan. And I also need to thank our editor, our 2 editor, Professor Tencent and Professor Brian, for bringing us together and for this very wonderful and incredible editor volume. And I'm Cao Yin. I'm teaching Indian history and global history in Tsinghua University in Beijing. And 3 years ago, I finished a book. It's about the Sikh diaspora in Shanghai during the colonial period. And at that time, I have a chapter which is not included in my book. That is Hong Kong's Sikh community, which I'm lucky enough to be invited to participate in this project and bring my unfinished article here in this edited volume. And now I'm working on another project, which is about the Chinese sojourners, Chinese smugglers, deserters, soldiers in India during the Second World War. So it's different one, but it's also about India and China. And I'm honored to be here to present our section 3, cultures and mediators. And in this section, actually, we have four chapters, and in all 4 chapters, I think it's just a reflection of what Professor President Dwyer said, that how to rescue history of this culture and mediators from the nation. That or if you read all of this 4 chapters, you'll find that it's kind of the culture and the mediators between India and China. Some of them cannot be accommodated into the national history, whether it's Indian national history or Chinese national history. And we have to explore some alternative methodologies and primary sources to write down their history, the alternative history. And I will just briefly introduce the 4 chapters in this section. And the first chapter written by Professor Li Youting, who is an assistant professor in the Graduate Institute of National Development in National University, National Taiwan University. And this chapter entitled Tagore and China Reconsidered, studying from a conversation with Feng Younan. By exploring a conversation between Tagore and Feng Younan that happened in 1920 in New York City. So this chapter tries to shed light on how Tagore and his Chinese intellectual counterparts in the 1920s developed Orientalist perception on China and India respectively. So this chapter actually examines the interconnections between the thought of Tagore, Feng Younan, Liang Shuming, and other Chinese opinion leaders of early 20th century. And by contrasting these interconnections with Tagore's interactions with contemporary Western thinkers, it is hoped that a new perspective will emerge to reveal the depths of the intellectual exchange that took place between modern China and India. So move to the second chapter in this section, written by Brian Xu, our main editor in this volume. And Brian is an associate professor in the Department of Chinese Culture in Hong Kong Polytechnic University. And his chapter entitled When Culture Meets State Diplomacy, the case of China Bhavana. Right? So Brian takes the China Bhavana, the center of Sino-Indian cultural studies in Western Bengal, founded by Tan Yunshan in 1937 to explore the promise and pitfalls of China-India interactions in the 1930s and the 1940s, especially during the Second World War. Right? So this chapter tries to unveil the complicated relations between Tan Yunshan, the Chinese nationalist government, the British colonial authorities, and the Indian nationalist intellectuals as well. So Brian provides us an ambiguous portrait of Tan Yunshan, who on the one hand was an idealist and a radical critic of capitalist modernity, but on the other hand, a pragmatist who used all possible opportunities to secure financial support from the Chinese nationalist government, and even by siding himself with nationalist political agendas. Right. So in the end, Brian argues that the China Bhavana was an important experiment for being an institutional articulation of how to say the civilizational ideal of vision of national Asianist unity that was supposed to overcome the violence and the mutual suspicion between modern nation states. However, it was also true that China Bhavana was embroiled in wartime nationalist politics and great power diplomacy, despite its transcendental vision. So our third chapter in this section, written by myself, erecting a Gurdwara on Queen's Road East, the Sikh Sabha movement, the Boxer Uprising, and the Sikh community in Hong Kong. So this chapter examines origins of the Sikh temple in Hong Kong and its transnational and translocal implications. So I find that the Sikh Sabha movement, which was a Sikh religious movement that happened in the late 19th century in Punjab, stimulated the building of Gurdwaras across the region in northwestern India, right? So as tens of thousands of the Sikh population migrated from Punjab to Southeast and East Asia in the late 19th and early 20th century. So most of the Sikh migrants were soldiers and policemen, right? So the Sikh Sabha movement participants and those Sikh priests, they went along with these Sikh migrants and supported the building of Gurdwaras, not only in Punjab, but also in Singapore, Penang, Bangkok, Hong Kong, Shanghai, and beyond. So the building of the Hong Kong Gurdwara was one of them, right? Was financially supported by Sikh soldiers who were dispatched by the government of India to China to fight against the Chinese Boxers in 1900. And the final chapter written by Janice Zheng, who just completed her PhD degree in the Department of History at Duke University in the US. And this chapter entitled Mecca Between China and India, Wartime Chinese Islamic Diplomatic Mission Across the Indian Ocean. So in this chapter, Janice tells the story of the Chinese Islamic Goodwill Mission, which was dispatched by the Chinese nationalist government to the Near East, Middle East, during the Second Sino-Japanese War for obtaining the support and sympathy of the Islamic world. So in this chapter, Janice examines the mission's activities, not in the Middle East, but in India on its way to Mecca. So its interactions with local, Indian Muslim leaders and the Chinese Muslims who settled down, who migrated from China, especially from Xinjiang, settled down in India. So she argues that the Chinese Islamic delegations to India between 1937 and 1945 paved the way for the establishment of official diplomatic relations between nationalist China and Pakistan upon the latest founding. So that's a summarize of these chapters in my section. So back to you, Tencent.
Thank you so much, Cao-En. And again, following the trend, there are lots of new things in these chapters. And one argument that India-China contacts extend beyond India-China, as can be seen from Janice's chapter, where she brings in the Near East or the Middle East. So if you can move it to the next slide, Brian. This is the final section of the book, and it has 4 chapters as well. And to introduce this section, I'll invite Anne, and if you could introduce yourself and then talk about the chapters.
Sure. Hi, my name is Anne Reinhardt. I'm a professor of history at Williams College in Massachusetts in the US. I am a historian of China primarily, but got very interested in this project and was very pleased to be included in the volume because I have been doing work on trying to use shipping as a way of understanding semi-colonialism in China and trying to sort of describe what that is. And I found over the course of that long research for my first book that it was very difficult to articulate the specificity of what is going on in China in the 19th and 20th century without having some recourse to the experience of India as well. So again, I found a comparative framework very helpful in that early work and was, again, pleased to be able to bring it into this group as well. And section 4 of our volume is entitled Building and Challenging Imperial Networks. And the methods in this section are fairly straightforwardly historical. The section consists of 4 essays that address different relationships, interactions, and comparisons between India and China in the early to mid 20th century and extending as late as the 1960s. So again, as many of the other sections of the volume, many of these pieces also introduce readers to either newly opened or very much underexplored archival collections that offer new perspectives and new perspectives on connections between India and China in this period of kind of early to mid 20th century. So I'm going to introduce each of the essays very briefly and then talk about some common themes that I see among them. But first, we have Madhavi Thampi's essay, Indian Political Activism in Republican China. And many of you probably already know, Professor Thampi is currently an honorary fellow of the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi and formerly a member of the Department of East Asian Studies at Delhi University. But her essay examines China, particularly Hong Kong and the Eastern Treaty Ports, as important sites of recruitment and political mobilization by Indian anti-imperialist organizations and by exiled Indian nationalists. So drawing on materials from the National Archives of India and colonial office records in Hong Kong, she details the political activities of both these activists as well as migrant working communities of soldiers, police, watchmen, among others, who contributed to sustained political activism from the early part of the 20th century through the 1930s. The second essay is by Wenshuo Liao, who is the associate researcher at Academia Historica in Taipei. And her essay, Between Alliance and Rivalry, Nationalist China and India During the Second World War, utilizes newly available military, diplomatic, and intelligence sources in the Kuomintang Party archives and in the Chiang Kai-shek collection, among others at Academia Historica in Taiwan, to explicate a range of examples of how nationalist China's changing understanding of India and Indian politics informed diplomacy and national policies during the early stages of the Pacific War. So in particular, she examines diplomatic overtures by Chiang Kai-shek and other Kuomintang leaders to Indian leaders, as well as the achievement of the Kuomintang's wartime intelligence networks there. My essay, which is called Shipping Nationalism in China and India, compares the leaders of two important Indian and Chinese shipping companies in the early 20th centuries and their respective engagements with shipping nationalism, which is the term I use to encompass political and entrepreneurial efforts to challenge British and Japanese domination of shipping trades and markets, as well as attempts to establish national merchant fleets in both cases. And in my essay, despite unmistakable parallels in these two men's understandings of the problems they faced and the solutions they proposed for them, my study remains a comparison rather than a case of actual interaction or connection. So as far as I can tell, they did not know of one another's activities or really actively engage with shipping nationalism in contexts other than their own. And I'll describe what I think the significance of that is in just a moment. And Tansen Sen, who needs no further introduction, his essay is entitled The Chinese Intrigue in Kalimpong, Intelligence Gathering and the Spies in a Contact Zone, in which he makes use of the records of the intelligence branch of West Bengal in the State Archives of Calcutta to examine the hill town of Kalimpong in Northwest India as a site of covert espionage activities involving Chinese, Indian, and Tibetan interests. And his essay traces how the intelligence branch amassed knowledge on Chinese agents in Kalimpong and how that knowledge was put to different uses as the geopolitical relationship between India and China transformed. So again, Tansen's essay emphasizes the continuities in the Indian government's intelligence concerns and activities in this area before and after independence, noting that the more dramatic shifts come only in the late 1950s with the deterioration, as he says, of Sino-Indian relations. All four of these essays start from the premise that the existing structures of empire in Asia, as well as the efforts to dismantle them, were sites of significant opportunity for connection, and at times the possibility of solidarity between Indian and Chinese actors in the first half of the 20th century. And in all 4 essays, the British Empire in India, as well as its presence in China, furnished many of the structures, be these the migrant communities ripe for political mobilization, the limitations on wartime diplomatic alliances, shipping networks and systems, and longstanding intelligence networks and priorities. And in most of these papers as well, these structures are further complicated and at times brought into crisis by Japan's imperial ambitions. So again, something that we've been discussing throughout this session, Japan appears throughout these 4 essays in different guises, as a model and a mentor in some cases, as obviously an antagonist and threat in others, and in one case as a kind of outside observer. But in focusing on these structures in different spaces and contexts, the essays in this section highlight shared experiences and predicaments that China and India faced in the early 20th century. And the negotiation of connections based on such experience can reveal to us both new facets of what might seem to be very kind of old or maybe very overdetermined problems of anti-imperialist or nationalist movements, as well as a greater understanding of the persistence and the continued relevance of the structures of empire. But at the same time, this section of the book also can draw our attention to the limitations and constraints on modes of connection and interaction between China and India in this particular historical context. So just to point out, Wen Shuo's essay, for example, shows how the Kuomintang had to subordinate its hopes for a closer relationship with the Indian National Congress, its counterpart, to its wartime alliances with Britain and the United States. And while Madhavi is able to show a very important transnational dimension of Indian nationalist political mobilization in China, my study of the parallel preoccupations of Indian and Chinese shipping entrepreneurs in the same period suggests that their commitments were to a narrower and much more exclusive concept of nation. And this is the irony and the sort of challenge that Ambassador Raghavan was pointing out earlier. And now, again, I just want to point out that this was not simply a failure of imagination, but a response to concrete conditions of imperialist domination in shipping that constructed shipping essentially as a national or exclusively national industry. And Tansen's essay shows how cross-border movement and trade at Kalimpong engendered similar suspicions and security questions for both the colonial and the post-colonial states. So I'm trying to point out how the obstacles to connection in these contexts are often the product of these historical actors' enmeshments in larger global systems of domination or subordination. And under these conditions, sometimes these very powerful possibilities that might come from connections between India and China remain elusive or limited. So of course, as many others have pointed out, that particularly the revelation of these really fascinating archival sources that many of the scholars in this section have done point us to many new topics and dimensions of this process yet to be discovered. So again, I'll join my colleagues in suggesting that these are questions that are raised by this section, but the section is far from exhausting the possibilities for research and interrogation there.
Thank you so much, Anne. We are running out of time, but I think this was a good introduction to the book, a good advertisement for the book, and it will be available on Amazon, both in the US and in India soon. E-version will be available from the 15th of December, so you can order the book or the e-version from there. I'll just end with one slide about where we are going with this, and then maybe open up for Q&A from the remaining time. So if Brian, if you can move to the next slide. After doing most of the studies with the archives, our aim was to do pre-1947, but we ended up doing post-47 as well. And we realized that there's a lot of material in the 1950s that's coming up, especially with the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library opening up the Nehru Papers. So with Arunabh Ghosh, who has written a wonderful article with regard to why we must look at 1950s from a different perspective rather than just geopolitical. We are looking at the Nehru papers and trying to find out the ways in which connections and comparisons that we have highlighted in this volume can also be used to study the 1950s, which remains for many of us still an unexamined decade. And so that's what we are doing right now. We are also working on methods in India-China studies or China-India studies that came up during our writing of this book and the research on this book. And we are working on a workshop and we are working on publications on both these topics. They will be coming out within the next year or so. Those of you who are interested in joining us, you're welcome to write to us and we'll involve you in that. We're also creating a database on the archival research that we have done, the things that Madhvi has collected from the National Archives in India, that I have collected from the West Bengal State Archives, that Chanka has collected from Shanghai and Chongqing. We want to put this on a database at our Center for Global Asia in Shanghai so that many other people interested in archives could use. And I should just do an advertisement for my article that is coming out in Journal of Asian Studies next year, early next year, on the state of China-India studies, which I hope will be of use to many of the people still hanging out and listening to what we have to say. So we'll end with one final slide. This is, if Brian, you missed the slide, go back, Brian. Yes, we don't only work in archives, we also have fun. This is my apartment in Shanghai. We celebrate our research by cooking Indian food and eating Indian food. So if you join us, you won't be spending all the time in archives. You'll also spend time hanging out with us and eating with us. Thank you so much.
Okay, now that, Tansen, is really an inducement to join, right? So now we've got just about under 10 minutes, and what I will suggest is that I'll just go through because there's no hand raised, which means that there are just some questions which have been written. One general one, which I've also got messages you've already answered, Tansen, about people wanting to get this book. So where do they get it from? So that you've answered. Now, a couple of very specific questions, and then there are some larger questions, which is stemming from the, as I mentioned, the current kind of hang that we are in, which is that how much India is really relevant to China. Aren't Indians overstressing their feelings that somehow India is important to China? I think, this is, as I said, in that category, which is dominated by the current issue, but that's one kind of question. But the more specific ones are about one, which is, in fact, we have Prabhavati, who has put in a lot of questions. She wants to know how much of Amitabh Ghosh is fiction and how much is true, because it's there also, his books also pertain to this period. And she also wants to know, Chongqing was the main point of supplies in World War II, and is there any material available for this? Now, Jabin has typed in a huge question. Jabin, would you like to say it out or read it out?
Can I quickly answer the former two questions?
Yeah, okay.
I think if you ask Amitabh Ghosh, he would say his books are fiction. He's writing non-fiction for India, China, which will come out in 2 years. But the Ibis trilogy, he would say, is fiction. But if you look at what sources he has used, they are mostly archival sources. But it has a very important message, the books, which I think can be seen and understood, and Madhvi can perhaps add to it because it involves the period that she has worked on, the Parsis. You can get a very important perspective that we historians perhaps cannot offer and usually are very dry about. So I would encourage people to read Ibis trilogy and then go to the archives and join us. Chongqing's material is available. Chanka has compiled a lot of material about that. We'll be putting the information on the database, and I hope somebody will actually look at that. I don't know if Madhvi or anybody wanted to add anything. If not, Jabin has a today question, I see.
So Jabin, would you like to speak out your question?
Sure. First of all, congratulations, Tansen and Brian, for this book. I haven't got a hold of it, but I do teach the chapter on Pan-Asianism from Tansen's book on connected history to my students as an introduction to China course. And I'm also pleased to see Professor Anne Reinhardt here, whose work on navigating semi-colonialism. I have the section of that in actually another course on science, tech, and IR, international relations. But so Tansen, my question is long, but with a long preamble, but it's a very straightforward, simple question, as in this current milieu of Hindutva politics, increased nationalism in China, how do we, how is Pan-Asianism relevant anymore? I quote specifically Ramnath Biswas, who cycled all the way to China. His ardor was great, but there are no such opportunities anymore. And that ardor is constantly challenged, with what goes on around or in India-China relations. So, how do we, deal with this reality?
Jabin, if you look at the title of our book, it's called Beyond Pan-Asianism. So you have to go beyond Pan-Asianism to address these issues. Because it did not work in the past. I don't think it's going to work in the future. It's a whole different things that needs to be done, starting with actually building good China studies program in India. And if whatever Ramnath Biswas did, cycling along in China, we should do that more. And let's invite the Chinese to come and also bicycle around in India. Unless that happens, I think the main goal of Pan-Asianism may have been to encourage people-to-people contacts. And I still believe in that. Unless that happens, we are not going anywhere. I don't know if I want to add on that, but
that's what I was just about to say, that would any of your panelists want to come in on any issue for a quick minute or so?
Can I say something perhaps with
yes, Brian, of course.
On Jabin's question, whether the relevance of Pan-Asianism. Well, there are two types of Pan-Asianism that have have developed. One in the beginning was more of a sort of bottom-up sort of phenomenon involving radicals and intellectuals that were many of them based in Tokyo and was open to these ideas. And then later on, of course, Pan-Asianism became a sort of state-driven project, and that, of course, became, after the end of the Pacific War, Second World War, a Pan-Asianism as a political project was no longer feasible. I mean, it morphed into something else with the Third World project. But Pan-Asianism as a sort of a way of thinking about how India, sort of scholars in Asia, not only China, India, but across Asia, can get together and think of sort of developments and ways to go beyond sort of Asian American, sort of rural American hegemony is still, I think, a very useful and very sort of possible venture. Of course, it really depends on what Tansen was saying. There needs to be a stream of people contact, like what we are doing right now, on even virtually, and then so that's why I brought in the whole idea of the China-Asia's method, because we don't particularly have a consensus of the usefulness of this particular idea, but the impulse on the part of Chen Guangxing in Taiwan to where they bring together regularly interest scholars in Asia to talk about issues in Asia from the Asian perspectives is, I think, something that we can sort of think more about. I mean, we don't need to go through London or Washington and New York all the time, but we can do it through Shanghai, Delhi, Hong Kong, Taipei, whatever. Yeah, so that's my response to rambling response to Jacqueline's comments.
I also quickly add something, please?
Yes, please, 1 minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, building on Tansen's point about having Chinese studies programs, that related to that is the importance for language study. And part of the project of Pan-Asianism in the early 20th century was, more so than thinking of a concept of Asia together, part of the impetus was to disrupt dominant narratives, to think beyond imperialist colonial paradigms. And so today, in order to really go beyond the kinds of narratives that we see in popular media that we're inundated with, we really have to start at the bottom with language study, which will enable us to go to new texts, to look at those texts that don't make it into the mainstream narratives. And so I really would stress the importance of those very foundational building blocks. And one of those essential building blocks is really language study. And the challenge is all the more compounded for our Chinese colleagues because there are so many languages to contend with. But on the India side, in China, we don't have access in English to the amount of materials that we do in the context of colonial archives in India, for example, or even post-colonial ones. And so, especially for us Indians, I think it's really important to start with our good, solid foundations in language study.
Well, you couldn't have underlined a more important issue, and that's really, as the Hindi phrase goes, it's a dukhti rag, it's a painful vein in, our scholarship on China. But yes, we have to work on that. So there are the usual compliments, and the rest of the chat box has some compliments for the great effort you've done. And Arnab has replied to the question on Amitabh Ghosh's sources. So by 2022, there may be a book appearing over there. There are so many things that one would really like to respond to, but I'm afraid we've just now run out of time. So I would now have to, unfortunately, stop the questions at that point. But in conclusion, that whole point that came through, when I started off by saying that the atmosphere is really one which is permeated by a lot of angst and a lot of distrust and so on. And in that context, when we are discussing a book on beyond Pan-Asianism, India, China, connected histories, circulatory kind of issues, then we still have a question about well, how important is India to China? And so may I request our keynote speaker who straddles the divide, between the academic kind of issues on one hand, but as a diplomat, how do you ultimately address this question of how important are China and India to each other? You did mention in your keynote that China and India will be this is a very important relationship. So maybe you could give us some concluding thoughts and then we'll wrap up the show. Ambassador Raghavan?
Thank you. I wasn't prepared for this, but well, I think there's no doubt. Certainly from an Indian perspective, China is very important. And I would imagine from a Chinese perspective, the same view would be there. Why is it so? You're large countries, you're very proximate to each other, and you have a history of adversarial relations. So if for no other reason, these three factors make a kind of an imperative that you do give importance to this relationship. It is, in today's world, you cannot ignore powerful neighbors with whom you have a history of adversarial relations in your long-term national interest. So I think in that very practical day-to-day sense, the importance of both countries for each other is self-evident. But having said that, there are of course other factors also, not least of which is the fact that both countries have long traditions of giving importance to intellectual activity. I don't think one can understand either China or India, quite regardless of their relationship with each other. We can understand either of these countries without taking into account the very great importance both have given for a very long period of time to intellectual discourse and intellectual activity. And when you have two neighbors which have that kind of tradition, it is inevitable that scholars and intellectuals on both sides will find commonalities, which will in many ways transcend the immediate and the present day force of events. Is it possible for scholarship to remain unaffected by the prevailing geopolitics of the times? I don't think it is. I don't think one can be unrealistic in assuming that in any situation, anywhere in the world, that contemporary factors do not have an impact on intellectual activity. So I think these difficulties are there, but they are by no means unique to India and China. These are situations under which scholarship exists all across the world and has possibly always existed in these circumstances. And a certain amount of atmosphere which has a zing to it, I think acts as a push for even better scholarship.
Well, I think thereby you have made a absolutely undisputable and unchallengeable case for promoting the study of China in India, and that there needs to be some very, very serious thought given to removing the kind of obstacles and problems, some of which were referred to by Jabin, in the way of this scholarship. And sure, it may not be unaffected by the temporality of the situation. But I think Beyond Pan-Asianism actually makes a case for in-depth studies which can actually go away from the whole hustle and bustle of what's happening on the border and explore a past and explore a period which can actually then come into the present. I mean, that's what the study of the past is all about, that it helps you shape your future. And so for that I thank you for your input, and thanks to all the participants, to the panel, to the editors, to all the people who have come together to make this webinar so brilliant. And I hope
to you, Alka, thank you for sharing, and the Institute of Chinese Studies staff for managing this. So I think we really appreciate how you have managed this. This is our first book launch for this book. And so thank you.
Many more to come, if what you said is any indication. So thank you all very much. I'm sure we will have plenty to think about, especially those who are looking at these things. Have a good night or good day or whatever it is, wherever you are. Goodbye all. Stay safe and wear your masks.
Thank you.
Thank you.